rester debout. Confederation Center acknowledges that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the PI Mi'kmaq. We acknowledge with respect the history, spirituality, and culture of the Mi'kmaq people who have been here for over 15,000 years. Le Centre des arts de la Confédération reconnaît que nous nous trouvons sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé du peuple Mi'kmaq de l'île du Prince-Édouard. C'est avec respect que nous rendons hommage à l'histoire, la spiritualité et la culture du peuple Mi'kmaq qui habite ce territoire depuis maintenant plus de 15 000 ans. Now, performing au Canada, please welcome Confederation Center Youth Chorus under the direction of Donald Fraser. La chorale, sous la direction de Donald Fraser, va maintenant entamer notre hymne national. Seated. Veuillez vous asseoir. La chorale va maintenant interpréter Mountain Climb, qui a été écrite pour la jeune compagnie du Centre des arts de la Confédération en 2017. Next, the chorus will perform Mountain Climb, a song originally written for the Confederation Center Young Company production of the Dreamcatchers in Canada 150 celebrations.
Everything
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Mr. Robert Sear, Chair of the Fathers of Confederation Buildings Trust, and Mr. Claude Métras, who, at the request of the Premier of Prince Edward Island, officially represented the province of Quebec on the board of the Fathers of Confederation Buildings Trust, and he is now a member of the Symons Medal Committee. Mesdames et Messieurs, Monsieur Robert Sears, président du groupe fiduciaire des édifices des Pères de la Confédération, et Monsieur Claude Métras, qui en 2004, à la demande du Premier ministre de l'île du Prince-Édouard, a été nommé membre du conseil de direction du groupe fiduciaire des édifices des Pères de la Confédération, représentant le Québec, et qui est maintenant membre du comité de la médaille Symons.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this, the 19th Symons Medal Ceremony and Lecture on the State of Canadian Confederation. Special thanks to John Fraser and the Confederation Centre Youth Chorus for that superb performance. So bravo. Your Honor, Lieutenant Governor Antoinette Perry, Senator Murray Sinclair, Senator Brian Francis, Senator Mike Duffy, Senator Diane Griffin, Chief Justice David Jenkins, the Honourable Premier Dennis King, Chief Junior Gold of the Abiguet First Nations, Chief Darlene Bernard from the Lennox Island First Nations, Regional Chief Roger Augustine, Assembly of First Nations, Poet Laureate Julie Pellissier-Lush, Mayor Philip Brown, Councillor Mike Duffy, Mr. Steve Bellamy, CEO of the Confederation Centre, Mr. George Kitching, co-chair of the Symons Medal Committee, ladies and gentlemen.
En cette 19e édition de la remise de la médaille Symons.
In this 19th edition of attributing the Symons Medal, I want to underline the visionary spirit. This, as a chair of this board, we wanted to make sure that this event was taking place in both official languages. This conference has a major objective to offer an occasion to the citizens in Canada to express their visions.
The first meetings of the Fathers of Confederation in Charlottetown, 1964. Confederation Centre was built to commemorate the 100th anniversary of that Charlottetown Conference. The 2019 Symons Medal Lecture is funded each year by the Symons Trust Fund of the Confederation Centre of the Arts Foundation. And nothing here at the Confederation Centre would be possible without the generous support of the following: the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Province of Prince Edward Island, the City of Charlottetown, and the Province of Quebec.
We also want to thank Robert and Kimberly Sear of their support. This is for their endowment fund that is done annually for this Symons Medal Lecture. I will now invite the Honourable Dennis King, Premier of Prince Edward Island, to say a word of welcome. Same in English.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On a personal note, as a former storyteller and performer, one of my dreams was to be on the stage of the Confederation Centre of the Arts in front of a full house. Perhaps my story will be more serious than it would have been in the past, but thank you very much for the honor to be here, Your Honor. My colleagues from the Legislative Assembly, Chiefs Bernard and Gould, Regional Chief Augustine, Senators Francis, Griffin, Duffy, and of course Sinclair, Chief Justice David Jenkins, distinguished guests, Your Worship Mayor Philip Brown, Islanders, friends, and ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour tout le monde, hello, quoi. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to extend a warm island welcome to today's lecturer, Senator Murray Sinclair. Welcome to Abbotsford, the land of the Mi'kmaq, where friends are always welcome. I also wish to extend my thanks and appreciation on behalf of all Prince Edward Islanders to Professor Tom and Christine Symons. Though they can't be here with us today, their presence is felt and missed. This lecture series is an important reminder to us all of what it means to be a Canadian and how privileged we are to have such a rich cultural history based on the simple action of people coming together, learning from one another, moving forward together for the betterment of everyone with a shared love for Canada. These are the very beliefs of Tom Symons, and it's what he has stood for throughout his whole life. He has a deep-rooted passion for Canada and has been an incredible friend and ambassador to Prince Edward Island and to the Confederation Centre of the Arts. Like Tom and all of you, I share a deep passion for Canada and for Prince Edward Island. I strongly believe that we live in the greatest place in the world. This quilt that is Canada has many patches on it. As Canadians, we are diverse, we are different, but in the end, we all believe in trying to do what we can to make our communities, our provinces, and our country better. We all have a role to play in that. It's not hard to look around us and see that our neighbors to the south and many of those across the oceans have stopped listening to one another. How people have focused on what divides them as opposed to what unites them. Not only is that sad and disturbing, but that attitude holds us back from reaching our full potential. We haven't been immune to it here either. If we are honest and truly look within, we will see that we have not always done a great job of listening to each other or doing what is best for all of our people. But we can change that, and we are changing that. Islanders and Canadians have asked us as political and community leaders to find a way to work together, to put aside partisanship and divisiveness, and put our focus on people and to do what is best for our people. That requires a change of attitude. And I'd like to take the time to applaud the 27 members of our PEI's Legislative Assembly who have not only embraced that change, but who collectively have become a leading voice in the effort to bring long-needed change to our political institutions. The rest of Canada is watching us, and I know they are proud, they are excited, and they are hopeful to see this change in attitude and approach make its way across this great country. And in that same vein, we can all learn something from Senator Murray Sinclair today, who is not only a proud Canadian, but an advocate for doing what is right for people. His ingrained sense of leadership and moral drive to do what is right guided him throughout his career to be an agent for change, to lead by example, to fight for what he believed in as a member of his community, as a lawyer, as a judge, as a teacher, as a senator, but most importantly, as a proud Canadian. Throughout the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he challenged Canadians with the same message. Remind ourselves of the gravity of the duty that we as a country and as a people have to ensure that we learn from the past so that we can do better in the future. And as we sit here today, just steps away from where a pivotal moment in our country's history took place in 1864, it is important that we keep a hand on the past while we reach for that future, to not only learn from our mistakes and missteps, but to recognize our successes as they happen and to build upon them. We must not ever forget that wrapped within challenge is an incredible opportunity to do better and to be better. And we will do that, and we will do it well, only if we do it together. Merci, thank you, well Alain, and enjoy the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Premier, for those inspiring and thoughtful words. And just as a brief bit of information, the Premier is also celebrating a birthday today. So happy birthday. The Symons Medal is named after Professor Thomas H.B. Symons, a great Canadian visionary, educator, and fellow member of the Trust. We are pleased to recognize Professor Symons and his contribution to Canada. Unfortunately, Professor Symons is unable to join us today, but we're certain he's watching online as you're very passionate about the country and its future. So welcome, Tom, from us here on Prince Edward Island. We will now introduce the 2019 Symons Medalist. Senator Murray Sinclair served the justice system of Manitoba for over 25 years. He was the second Indigenous judge to be appointed in Canada and the first in Manitoba. He served as co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as chief commissioner in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As chair of the commission, he participated in hundreds of hearings across the country, culminating in the issuance of the Commissioner's Report in 2015. He also oversaw a multi-million-dollar fundraising program to support the various Commission's activities and to allow survivors to travel and attend Commission events.
Le sénateur Sinclair a été invité à prendre la parole au Canada.
Senator Sinclair was invited he was the professor of law at the University of Manitoba. He was very active within his profession. He earned several prizes, a national prize for excellence for Native for First Nations, one for his career. He got honorary doctorates, PhDs from 8 Canadian universities. He was named at the Senate on April 2nd, 2016.
With our 2019 Symons Medal, and we look forward to his lecture, Confederation, We Could Have Done Better. I now invite Julie Pellissier-Lush, Poet Laureate of Prince Edward Island, to come forward and welcome the Senator Sinclair to Mi'kmaq territory and to the stage. And I might ask the Premier to join us back up on stage as well, please.
Kwe, Jalasi, Undeloisi Julie. Hello, welcome. Elders, leaders, earth changers, honored guests. I would like to thank the Confederation Center of the Arts for inviting me to be a part of this amazing day. I am humbled and honored to be here. I am Mi'kmaq, and I reside in this beautiful unceded territory known as Mi'kma'ki, and I would like to welcome you all here in peace and friendship. And most especially, I would like to honor and welcome Senator Murray Sinclair, who has traveled halfway across this country to be with us here today. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for sharing your words, and thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And now, Walalan, Miigwech, our wonderful Senator Murray Sinclair.
Thank you.
Bonjour, Nakanasutuk, Mzinigijik, Indigenous Kigo Dodem. In my language, I greet you and I thank the elder for the welcoming song and the prayer and for greeting me here in that traditional way. Your Honor, thank you for being here and thank you for the welcoming reception yesterday. I appreciate the opportunity to spend that time with you and to share a few words, and for the gift of tobacco that you offered me. Very meaningful. Thank you. And to all of the leaders and the honored guests who are here, thank you for being here and for, by your presence, sharing this day as well, because this day is very meaningful to me, a very special day. And all of you who are here, I thank you for that reception, for the standing ovation that you gave me at the beginning to acknowledge the work in which I have been a small part of over the years, and to show your openness and welcoming as well. I want to thank the chair of the board for the kind introduction. Introductions are always a scary moment for me in these events, because I'm never quite sure, A, whether they have the right document in hand, because I have been introduced on one occasion by somebody who had the wrong introductory sheet. One time I was being introduced by a young University of Toronto law student because I was speaking to the faculty of law in the University of Toronto, and this young student had been sent a copy of my bio sheet, which at that time was only 12 pages long. Now it's a little bit longer, and so she got up and her remarks consisted of saying this: I have read Justice Sinclair's resume, and I want you to know it's too long for me to read to you. But having read it, I can assure you, she said, he is a well-rounded man. Though generally I like brevity and accuracy in the remarks of welcome. But on that occasion, I'm not quite sure it was all that key to me. I know that those of us who are participating in public events often wonder what it is that's expected of us. When I was invited to be here, I was giving some thought to what it was that I should talk about. And so the topic that you were told was my topic is one that I chose. Confederation, we could have done better. So let me talk about that in a minute. But I do realize, of course, that titles can be off-putting or they can be enticing. So I'm not sure how you saw that when you saw it. And the fact that you're here, maybe you're interested in knowing what I meant by that. I was invited a number of years ago on the anniversary of the birth of Sir John A. Macdonald once to give a lecture to the Manitoba Historical Society celebrating his birth. And the president of the Historical Society was the wife of one of my colleagues in the court, but the vice president was my former University of Manitoba history prof, and I was a history major before I went to law school. And so when they invited me to come, they asked me if I would deliver a lecture about Sir John A. Macdonald, and I said I'd love to. Now, don't get ahead of me here, okay? They didn't ask me the topic, just Sir John A. Macdonald. And so I started preparing some thoughts and some notes, and then about a week before the event, they called and they said, we're just preparing the poster, we're putting it up and circulating it and inviting guests, and so we'd like to know, what's the topic of your paper going to be? And I said, oh, well, that's easy. Why I hate Sir John A. And there was this long pause on the other end of the line, and all I heard was, oh. But they didn't interfere with my plan. They let me go ahead and prepare notes accordingly. But I did have a lot to say about his contribution to our country, and also his contribution to the relationship that we as Indigenous people have had with this country. Because I think, and I thought then and I think now, it was important for people to have a good grasp of our history. I want to acknowledge my colleagues who are here, the senators in the room, because I think they may have heard this story, but let me share it with you. When I was appointed to the Senate in 2016, I had been a judge for 30 years. I had been a lawyer for 8 years before that, and so my granddaughter, who was then just about 8 years old, when I was appointed to the Senate, called me up and said, Mushum, that's our word for grandfather, Mushum, she said, come to my school. I want to introduce you and have you, it's show and tell, she said. So I want to show you off to my class, and I want to tell them about you. And I said, okay, sure, I'll be there. So I went to her class and stood at the front, and she was speaking. She's a very good speaker. She's won a number of public speaking events in her short career as a student. In fact, I've helped her with writing her speeches, and she said to me one time, Mushum, thank you for all the help in writing speeches, but I have one question for you. And I said, what is that, my girl? And she said, how do you make them stand up at the end? I said, well, that's a secret. When you're older, I'll tell you. But in the classroom, she was introducing me. She told everybody all about my career as a lawyer and my career as a judge, and all about the work at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that I had done and what the commission was all about. She had come to all of the TRC events, and so she was well familiar with that work. And then she ended her remarks by saying, and now he's a senator. And put her hands on her hips, looked at me, and sat down. And a little boy put up his hands in the front row, and she looked at him and said, yeah, what's a senator do? And she stood up, she put her hands back on her hips, and she looked at me, and I realized that she had no idea. But you know, she's well taught. That did not faze her. She turned around to that little boy, she looked at him, and she said, he sanitizes. And then she looked at him for 5 full seconds with her hands on her hips as though to say to him, you got another stupid question you want to ask? If you're getting the impression that she's a bossy little girl, you got it. She comes from a long line of bossy women in our family, so she picked it up honestly. But it was a defining moment in our relationship, because now she tells everybody about that and about the work that I'm doing in the Senate, and she follows very closely. She's probably watching, in fact, this event on the broadcast, the webcast that's going on. And so I say hi to her, and I say hi to her class. But let's talk for a moment about Confederation and why Confederation is so much on our minds. Of course, I want to thank Professor Symons for sponsoring this lecture and for the medal. It's a great honor for me to be a recipient of it, and I want him to know that I really appreciate the fact that I was chosen this year to be one of the long list of wonderful human beings who have received this medal. And I'm sorry that he couldn't be here to be part of this gathering. Someday I'm sure we'll meet and have an opportunity to engage in some dialogue around some of the thoughts that I have. But Confederation, of course, was the defining moment for our country. But I want you to do what we in law school were taught not to do and never do. In fact, it was drummed out of us that the one thing we should never use when you're a lawyer is your imagination. We spent 3 years getting our imagination beat to death in our heads, and by the time we graduated, the only thing that was important to us was precedent and what other judges had said. There's a sign in the wall here as you're walking into Stephen's office which says, the most dangerous words in our world are, "We've always done it that way." And that's true in law. Stare decisis, the Latin expression for stand by the previous decisions, is the rule of thumb that every lawyer has learned to follow. And so in order for that to be effective, they tell us you have to stop thinking for yourself. You have to stop imagining what things could be like and could have been like. So we don't have any imagination when we come out of law school. Those of you who know lawyers know exactly what I'm talking about. Right? Am I right? Hey? Yeah. We have no imagination. In fact, one day, and this is a true story, one day my wife and I, when I was in law school, we're driving down the street, going shopping, and I was in the middle of studies, of course, at law school, and I stood up and I said, "That's a weird sign for a show or a place." And she said, "What?" I said, "A lien." And she said, "You're an idiot." I said, no, a lien. You know, that's a thing that goes on property titles. She said, "That's not a lien, that's alien." Well, nobody told me it was a movie. You know, for years I had been studying that word was a lien. So let's use our imagination now, okay? Imagine what it would have been like if the tables had been reversed at Confederation. Imagine what it would have been like if at Confederation the indigenous tribes of North America were in fact the ones who were confederating, that they were coming together in order to create a huge nation of indigenous people, and that they were taking into consideration the fact that all of these settlers were coming in from other parts of the world. And so in their dialogue, in their meetings with each other, they talked about how, as various tribes, various territorial owners, they were going to have territorial rights within their territory, but it was important for them to have a central governing authority in order to be able to hold this country together. So they created a national legislative body for themselves, and that became their Confederation of Indian Tribes. And that Confederation of Indian Tribes, among other things, had to consider, well, what are we going to do about all of these people who've been coming here lately and starting to occupy some of our lands? We've been permitting them to come here, but they're not part of our tribes. We haven't accepted them as tribal members, so what are we going to do with them? And each of the tribes said, well, you know, if they're in our tribal territory, they have to live by our laws, so we'll deal with it that way. But they said, ultimately, we have to define our relationship with them, so how are we going to do that? And so some wise elder at the time said, I'll tell you what, in our new Confederation constitutional document, let's create a provision that said that our federal body is going to have responsibility for dealing with these non-tribal people. They're going to be responsible for dealing with these settlers. So Section 9124 of the Confederation of Indian Tribes Act says that the federal national legislative body has responsibility for white settlers and lands that have been settled by them. with the agreement of an Indian tribe. So the federal entity has responsibility for them. Well, if that's all they did, then probably things could have moved along quite well. But then somebody may have thought, well, let's figure out what it is that we need to do, because are we going to allow them to vote in our processes? Are we going to allow them to participate as full tribal members? Are we going to give them the same rights as every tribal member is going to have? And the answer would be no, 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 we can't let them participate in our council meetings. We can't let them attend our gatherings. We can't let them speak out whenever they want. So we're not going to let them vote at our council meetings. So we'll take away their right to vote. We're not going to allow them to continue to speak their language either. So we're going to tell them that they have to start learning the tribal language of the place that they live. If they can't continue to go to their churches, we're going to ban their churches, and they have to start going to our ceremonies. And I tell you what, the easiest way to do all of this, let's take away their children, and let's indoctrinate their children into our various ways of doing things. And so they passed regulations and rules and practices that allowed them to take away the children from those settler families and put them into residential schools. Let's put them into schools in which we indoctrinate them into tribal ways of doing things. Let's make them stop speaking English or French. Let's make them start speaking Ojibwe, Cree, Mohawk, Dene, Inuit languages. Let's make them stop practicing their culture. Let's make them, in fact, let's make it illegal for them to practice their culture. They can no longer go to their own ceremonies. Their churches are all banned, and they can't gather in places. And if they want to go to court in order to try to challenge this, let's take away their right to go to court. So in order to go to court, they have to get permission from us to go to our courts. They no longer have courts. It's only our courts that exist. And so if we want them to go to court, they have to get permission from our tribal leaders before they can go to court. And if they can get permission, then they can go to court, but nobody ever gets permission, of course. And if they want to talk to lawyers who are legally trained in our laws about how they can still do something about this, let's make it illegal for the lawyers to talk to them unless they get permission from us first. And on top of that, if they happen to have tribal friends, if they have people who are members of tribes who want to go to court on their behalf, let's make them get permission before they go to court too. And if they don't get permission, they can't go to court. They can't challenge us. Well, what if they said, well, what if they protest? You know, they can gather in the streets and they can wave their signs. Let's make it illegal for them to protest. In fact, let's require that before they leave their small little land holdings, which we're allowing them to keep, that they have to get permission from us before they can leave their land holdings. And they have to get written permission. And they can only leave if they have a specific reason that we agree to. And that reason has to be something that is not contrary to our interests. And nobody ever gets a chance to do anything like that, to protest. And let's also do this. If they want to gather in order to put together a protest, to complain about what it is that we're doing, let's make it against the law. Let's call that a white man's conspiracy law. And if they're doing that, then we'll take that right away from them, so they can't gather. And let's prevent them from, in fact, even dressing up like white settlers. Let's take away their right to wear their own garb, to practice their own ceremonies. Let's make it illegal for them to go to their large gatherings, their large assemblies. And let's make it improper for them to even elect their own leaders. They can only elect the leaders according to our rules. And when they have a meeting, we have to be present And we can preside at that meeting, and we get to record everything, and we get to take all the documents and paperwork with us. Well, sounds far-fetched, doesn't it? Like, nobody'd ever do that. But Canada did that. Canada did that to Indigenous people from the moment of Confederation. Canada, in fact, passed the first Indian Act for the sole purpose of dealing with the responsibility that the Government of Canada took on to itself under Section 9124 of our Constitution Act of 1867, for the purpose of giving itself easier access to the tribal lands and holdings that they needed access to. And so they did exactly what I just talked about. They made it impossible for Indigenous people to go to court to challenge what the government was doing. They took the children away from the families and placed them in schools, away from their parents and away from the influence of their parents. They made it illegal for Indigenous people to practice their culture. They made it illegal for Indigenous people to gather together in order to complain or to discuss a grievance against the Government of Canada. They made it illegal to hire a lawyer. They made it illegal for the lawyers to give advice. They made it illegal for just about every possible response to whatever the government was doing. They made it illegal for Indigenous people to gather in their own council chambers. In 1892, they passed a law which said traditional Indigenous councils could only be selected in accordance with rules established by the Department of Indian Affairs. And those rules had to be supported by the government, and if they decide to have a meeting, the Indian agent could be present. He had to preside at the meeting. He had to be the one to record the notes, and he kept all the documents. Most Indian tribes do not have any archives because the Government of Canada took all of their documents away from them whenever they held a meeting for about 100 years. Most of the archives for Indigenous people are in the Government of Canada's archives. But probably the worst thing that they did, I think, was they disrupted Indian families. They disrupted Indigenous families. Métis, Inuit, First Nations people lost their children to the government. In and of itself, that was the single most insidious thing that a government can do to a family, is to take your children away from you. I want you to help me out here, if you don't mind. You all have cell phones, right? Take your cell phones out, if you don't mind. First of all, I want you to be sure that you're tweeting what I say today, because people are going to want evidence against me after I'm done here. So feel free to tweet as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if this building is preventing internet access, but look at your phones and open your photos and put up the photo for me, if you don't mind. I want you to look at your photos of your favorite child or a young child in your family. That's my bossy little Sarah. That's the one who now walks around with her hands on her hips permanently. Her proper name is Nemesienne Nibikwe, the one who appears from the water and who speaks for the water. So, do you have a picture like that in your photo? All right, show it to me. Just hold it up and show me their photos. Okay. What I'd like you to do for a minute, if you don't mind, is talk to the person next to you about that little child in the photo. Just tell them about this child. Take a minute. Feel free. Why do you like them? What do they do? What have they done lately? You know, I have to tell you that I've been doing presentations on residential schools virtually since the TRC was starting to end in 2014, so for quite a number of years now. And I always do this with crowds. I ask you to look at the picture of one of your children when they're little and talk about them. It's one of my favorite moments in the presentations I do because it shows how much love we have for our children. And so here's what I want you to do now. I'd like you to delete that photo. What? It's only a photo. Delete it. It's only a photo. But you can't. You won't. Even if you could, you won't. And I don't blame you. I would never delete a photo like this one from my stock of photos. In fact, if I could, I'd make 10,000 of them and give each of you one of them. And you would always remember that story I told you about her because you have it, because memories come from our children. Our relationship comes from our children. When I was a young man, I thought I was the brightest guy, and I thought I was the smartest guy in the world. You know, there was nothing I couldn't do. I was a top student. I was athlete of the year in my graduating class in high school. I was a valedictorian in my graduating class, and I went to a public school. And I was probably the only Indigenous guy who graduated in 1967. When I graduated, there were just over 180 graduates who graduated along with me, and I was their valedictorian. I spoke for them. And so I enjoyed a very successful educational experience. I went back and spoke to them afterwards at the 25th anniversary of our high school graduation, and I said to them at that time, you know, the one thing that I've learned, and I probably should have known it at that time, and I kind of felt it, but the one thing I've learned is that at that time, when I was enjoying all of that success that I thought was coming to me, none of you would ever have changed places with me. None of you would have wanted to be Indigenous, because in the public schools of this country, Indigenous people were not talked about in a good way. It all stems from the fact that the government of Canada in the 1880s started taking children away from their parents and placing them in residential schools for the purpose of indoctrinating them into being the kind of Canadian that Sir John A. Macdonald talked about in 1885 when he said, you know, if we educate these kids as we promised to do in the treaties, if we educate them in the schools in their home communities, they're just going to go every night back home and live with their parents. And they will continue to live the life that their parents lead, and their parents are nothing but savages. And so all that we're going to end up with at the end of the day are savages who can read and write. Sir John A. Macdonald said that in Parliament in 1885. And so based upon that, he justified to Parliament the building of numerous industrial schools and residential schools all across the country for the purpose of taking children away from their parents, away from their influence, away from their love, away from their modeling, in order to turn them into something that they weren't. In the course of our existence as human beings, we find that we need to answer 4 very important questions as we're growing up. We need to know, where do I come from? You know, one of the first questions, mothers in the room, you know, put up your hand, right? There you are. The very first question that your child will ask you, and has asked you probably, is, Mommy, how did I get in your tummy? Right? Mommy, where did I come from? And how did I get out of there? So they ask that question, where do I come from? But that question isn't just about that. That question is also about, where do we come from? Where do we come from as people, as human beings? And part of our seeking of knowledge is what is our creation story? How were we created? How were human beings created? And what is our creation story? We all have a creation story. I grew up not believing that we had one, actually. It wasn't until my eldest child was being born that I went and in search of information that I wanted him to have about that question. And at that time, that's when I learned what the Ojibwe creation story was. And we have a creation story, and it's all about how the Creator saw this beautiful place that he wanted to lower Anishinaabe, and he wanted to lower all the colors of man to this place so that we could live in peace and coexist with each other in our different ways of doing things. He had a road for each of us to follow. And when he lowered us to this place, he showed us the road that he wanted us to follow. And so as Anishinaabe people, we have a creation story and we have a road that the Creator wanted us to follow. Because at the end of the road, when we have finished walking that road, we can ask ourselves and answer the second question, which is, where am I going? And that question isn't just about, what am I going to eat tonight, Mom? Or what are we going to do tomorrow? What's happening this weekend? Or what am I going to be when I grow up? It's also about what happens when I die. What happens to me when I die? It's a very important question. We spend a lot of time teaching our children that. We want them to know that. And why do we want them to know that? If you think about it, it's because we want them to understand the importance of life. We're not encouraging them to die. We don't want them to feel that they're going to be stuck here forever. We want them to understand that when they leave this earth, there is a normal aspect to that. There is a belief about that they need not fear and that they should respect, and they should understand that it's not dangerous, it's not harmful. And we have a teaching about that. We have a teaching about how when you leave this earth, you go back to the Creator. And you go back to the Creator in spirit form. And when you are created, a spirit is given to you. A spirit comes to live within you. And that helps you answer the third question. The third question is, why am I here? What is my purpose in life? And that question is important to all of us. You all asked it. Some of you are still wondering, why the hell am I here? But you will answer that question. Why am I here? In our teachings, the answer comes from understanding our name. Her name, Nimijian Nibikwe, has a teaching to it, that she was seen in the dream of an elder coming from the water and dancing on top of the water and being able to speak for the water of this earth. That the water of this earth needed her and others like her to be able to speak for them. And so she is a water carrier, a water protector. And she knows that. She knows all the teachings of the water from a very young age. My name is Mizenegijik. Mizenegijik is the name of the spirit that was placed within me when I was born. And that spirit was placed within me by the Creator. Mizenegijik means pictures in the sky in our language. It literally means pictures in the sky. Mizene is picture, Gijik is sky. Mizenegijik, pictures in the sky. I'm not an artist. I couldn't draw worth a darn, still can't. But it's not about that, because there's a story behind that name. And the story is that there was this young man in the beginning before the beginning, they say. There was this young man who saw that his people were troubled and his people were in pain. His people were facing difficulties they couldn't cope with. And so he went in search of answers. He went to find out what it was that was going on, and he went to find out if he could help the people understand what was going on. Mzinigijik was the name that talks about that. What he did was he went into a quiet place, and he said to the Creator, Mishomis, help me understand what's going on. Mishomis, please help me. And he did that for days, put aside his food and his water, and for days he sat there praying to the Creator. The Creator didn't have an answer for him, at least not that he could hear, until one day this little animal popped up from the ground when this young man was getting frustrated and was railing at the Creator for not listening to him and not giving him the answer. This little creature popped up from the ground, and in the language, he said to him, you realize how stupid you are? Because the answer is right before you. The Creator has been sending you messages. It's in the sky. Look at what he is saying to you in the sky. And when he looked up, he could see images in the sky. And when he looked all across the sky, he put all of those images together into an understanding that helped him understand what was going on, why things were happening the way they were, and what people could do about that. And so he took that knowledge back to the people. And that's my name. That's my role. That's my purpose. And you may think that maybe I got that name last week or a few months ago. I was given that name when I was a little boy. I was given that name long before I went to law school. I was given that name, in fact, at the time that I was born. Mzinigijik, the one who speaks of pictures in the sky because his people will need him to explain what's going on, to help them understand, to help them look for and find the answers that they need in this time, in this age. So that was and that is my purpose in life. And I live that purpose every day. I lived that purpose when I was a lawyer. I lived that purpose when I was a judge. I lived that purpose in the Senate, and I lived that purpose in being here with you. Because that's who I am. And that's the fourth question. Who am I? Who am I? And that comes from answering all of those questions. All of those questions. And so that teaching about understanding who you are, where you come from, where you're going, why you're here, that teaching is a very important part of Ojibwe culture. But all of the children who were taken away from their families in our tribe were denied access to that knowledge. They were placed in schools where they were told that that teaching, that knowledge, that those teachings, and the language that was fundamental to understanding those teachings, that was all rubbish, that was irrelevant. The only teaching was through Christianization and civilization in the white man's way. And therefore, everything that you had been taught, everything that you may have known, everything that your parents would want you to know was not worth knowing anymore. And yet, I can assure you, we all grew up thinking, hoping, believing that there was more to our life than what we had been told. And Confederation was the beginning of a relationship between us that took that away from me, took that away from all Indigenous people in this country. We had a difficult time, you and I, my parents, your parents, my grandparents, your grandparents. We had a difficult time because the residential schools interfered with us. Those who were sent to residential schools, including my grandparents, my aunties, my uncles, my father, when placed in those schools, we were told that we were inferior, we came from inferior stock. We were savages, we were heathens, we were pagans, and that our only hope was through civilization and the white man's way, and that we were lucky, in fact, that the white man came here and saved us. If the white man had not come, we would have gone extinct. And that indoctrination convinced many of our people, in fact, to turn that way and to stop trying to think of who they were in their traditional sense and put aside those teachings and that learning and that yearning for knowledge. And as a result, we lost our way. We lost our sense of identity. But it wasn't just residential schools that did that. The public schools did the same thing as well. In the public schools, they said the very same thing. To all Indigenous kids in the public schools, your cultures are irrelevant. Your people were in the way of Confederation. Your people were standing in the way of the growth of this country. Your people were heathens, were savages, were backwards. They taught that in public schools. I can remember being in public school, and I was an excellent student, don't forget. I got top marks. And so I had to repeat this back to people, to teachers, in my exams and in my papers, that Indigenous people were savage, warrior-like people, were hunter-gatherers who had no sense of governance, who had no philosophy, had no way of understanding creation, had no way of understanding the world beyond the limited means that were at hand. They did not understand that we had philosophers, we had visionaries, we had people who related easily and would have related easily to the world internationally if we had been left to our own devices. We would be functioning quite well here today as Indigenous people if the white man had never come here, because we would have adapted to this changing world, as you have too. And that's what people need to understand, that we were as civilized and as equal as you were, and your ancestors were at the time that we first contacted each other. And finding that way for ourselves is important to our young people. We see it today in our education system, where the dropout rates are still high, but they're better than they used to be. Education is the key to our future. We know that. Education is the key to reconciliation, to changing our relationship. Because you see, in the public schools, when I went to public school, I was taught that my people were inferior and that European people who came here were superior to me. But that mythology had an impact upon the European children who were in class with me too, because they also saw me as inferior. They saw themselves as coming from superior stock. And so that had an impact upon our relationship as well. There were times when I was practicing law as a lawyer, or even when I was sitting as a judge, when I would have somebody appear in front of me who would come from my home community, who really believed, even at that point in time when I was sentencing him for a crime that he had committed, who still believed at that time that he was better than me because he was a white kid and I wasn't. It's an insidious form of racism that has defined our relationship for many years, and we need to begin to think about how we can change that. And we change that by recognizing the history that we come from, but we also need to change it by recognizing the impact it's had upon Indigenous kids. We have defined reconciliation in the TRC report as working towards the establishment of a respectful relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But before we can have that, we have to have a means by which Indigenous children can gain their sense of self-respect. We have the highest suicide rates among young Indigenous children in the whole world. Compared to the rest of the world, our young Indigenous kids are killing themselves in higher numbers at higher rates. And it's sad that they are, because they have so much to offer us. Our future depends upon them. But it isn't just a mental health issue. It has evolved perhaps into a mental health issue, but it begins with this idea that they have no hope, they have no future, they do not see themselves as being part of this society, and therefore they feel they do not belong. They are dissociated from this country because they see a country that does not want to include them on their own terms. But they're standing up against that. And I'd like you to see a short video that talks with their voice about how they now feel about their growing sense of strength. So please watch this video with me.
Let me find the current. There is reconciliation every time we learn.
My sole intent is to find a little OCM from the leaders of man, cause we're a ghost to them. Trying to spread truth, even to my closest friends. I'm not alone, my culture's what my home defends.
This ain't a game to lose, we need to trace our roots. Embrace the truth, it's what I came to do. The high suicide rates, the face the youth make me afraid, but listen, don't be ashamed of you.
Come and find me, come and find me.
Come back.
So I'm here to tell you one thing, and that is this. Confederation's not over yet. We still have some work to do. And that work is about how we're going to be able to complete the work that we started back in 1861, 1862, because we have a lot of things that we have to fix that we damaged along the way. But we also have to get to what I think the initial goal was. The Creator's telling me something? I'm not sure. The initial goal was for us to have a country in which we could coexist with each other, that we would be able to work and live side by side, that we would be able to treat each other with respect. That was not the intention of some of those who were part of that dialogue. It was certainly not the intention of Sir John A. Macdonald. I'm prepared to admit that. But good people were part of the country at that time. Good people wanted things to be better. And good people are still with us today. Good people on both sides of this dialogue around reconciliation, around Confederation, are the ones who are going to make this happen. And the reason it's going to happen is because you love your children, and I love mine. And I want them to be in a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sinclair. You're truly an inspiration to us all, so thanks once again. It is now my pleasure to invite PEI Senator Brian Francis to the podium to thank our 2019 Symons Medalist. From working in the front lines management, Brian Francis has over 40 years of experience with government positions. He served various capacities with public service from 2002 to 2007 as Aboriginal Coordinator with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. He also was one of the formal signatories to the Canada Mi'kmaq PEI Consultation Agreement, which set out the framework for consultation on proposed actions that could adversely impact asserted or established Aboriginal treaty rights in the province.
De 2007 à 2018, le sénateur Francis a été élu.
From 2007 to 2018, Senator Francis was elected Chief Administrator of the Abegweit Mi'kmaq Nation. He worked tirelessly to improve the well-being, social, economic, and cultural in his community. He's contributed to the access of education possibilities and jobs for members living on reserve or off reserve, and led several infrastructure projects.
In October of 2018. He is the first person of Mi'kmaq descent on PEI to serve in this role. He is also a past board member of the Confederation Centre of the Arts, and we are very pleased to have him back here again with us today. Please join me in welcoming Senator Brian Francis to the stage.
Your Honor, Lieutenant Governor Antoinette Perry, fellow senators, Premier Dennis King, Professor Symons, and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here in your company. I'm especially honored to be chosen to thank my colleague and friend, Senator Murray Sinclair. As a proud islander and now a senator, recognizing the importance of this small island as the first home to Confederation is significant. And the initiative of the Confederation Center of the Arts through this lecture series in presenting different views on the evolution of Confederation is an education for everyone. Receiving the Symons Medal named for someone who has contributed so much to Canadian studies and public policy is indeed an honor. And yes, I agree with Senator Sinclair this afternoon. When it comes to Confederation, we could have done better. Senator Sinclair's accomplishments have already been listed, and they are remarkable. And I can tell you firsthand that when he stands up to speak in the Senate chamber, everyone pays very close attention. His views are respected and never dismissed. As an Indigenous senator myself, I recognize the importance of having strong Indigenous voices in our Parliament. We have been underrepresented for far too long. The first Aboriginal senator, James Gladstone, was appointed when First Nations did not yet have the right to vote. As a matter of fact, when Murray and I were born, First Nations people did not yet have the right to vote. And we're not that old, Murray, are we?
Well, speak for yourself.
Okay. Senator Sinclair's remarks this afternoon indicate why he is so deserving of the Symons Medal. Distinguished recipients have gone before him, and each in their own way, they have made extraordinary contributions to Canada. Murray Sinclair's contributions are unsurpassed for myself and the millions of Indigenous people in Canada. Murray is very deserving of this honor. Personally, I want to thank him for being an example for people like me and offering me advice and support as we add our Indigenous voices to Canada's makeup. Yes, we could have done better in the beginning, but with Murray Sinclair's leadership, I am optimistic that this country will improve for Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. Congratulations, Murray, and thank you.
Thank you, Senator Francis. I now invite members from our audience to ask a few questions of Senator Murray Sinclair. So to pose your question, please approach a microphone either on the left or right-hand side of the center here. There's also microphones up in the balcony. And one of the staff members will help and direct you to the proper spot, and we'll go from there. So,
I think you guys can have a seat. Yep.
You want to answer from the?
I think I'm going to answer from the podium.
From the podium.
Yeah.
And
He's going to.
Senator Francis. I'm not answering.
You never know.
Yes, first question. My name's David Doughton. Welcome, Senator. I am wondering how you see the future of the Indian Act, whether you see that as being a process of deconstruction or replacement or simply elimination, and how you see that playing out from a legislative point of view.
I'm sorry, did you say Indian bands?
Indian Act.
Indian Act?
Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I think we have to recognize that the Indian Act is inherently a racist legislation. Its intention was not to enhance the powers or to recognize the authority of Indigenous people that were caught within its definition. But was intended to limit them and was intended to allow the government to exercise a controlling force over them. I think that, in fact, we should begin the conversation by asking ourselves the question, what kind of legislation would we expect to be put into place if the government were legislatively wanting to define its relationship with another nation in the world? They would probably define it by placing some limitations upon what their officials could and couldn't do. So I think what we really need to think about is whether we should be enacting a federal government limitation act in order to say that federal government cannot do certain things without the proper support of and consent of Indigenous people. Because this concept that we need to see Indigenous people, or First Nations people, as inherently being under the authority of the federal government and under the authority of the British Crown is an aged concept, one that is inherently based upon a false and racist doctrine, and therefore we need to understand that it's only a matter of time, I think, before it disappears from our law, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we want to redefine our relationship into the future? In the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we suggested two important pieces of legislation that we thought needed to be considered. One was a doctrine of reconciliation by which all of the parties, particularly the provinces and the federal government, agreed upon terms of reconciliation that would guide their own actions into the future, but that those terms would be terms that would be applicable to them, and that there would also be a royal proclamation on reconciliation, so that future government leaders and future government politicians would not willy-nilly be able to change the nature of the legal relationship, and that the covenant on reconciliation would also be signed by Indigenous nations as well, and Métis and Inuit people, all of which we felt was part of the lesson that we learned going forward, and that is that while there were certainly intention on the part of the Indigenous people about what kind of relationship they wanted to have with the people of Canada, and there was intention on the part of the government of Canada as to what kind of relationship they wanted to have, or at least there was a public statement by the government of Canada as to what kind of relationship they wanted to have. In that conversation, they forgot about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Crown itself defined that its relationship would be one of respect of equal nations.
Well, and thank you, merci.
Thank you. We have a question now on this side with Rosie.
Kwe, Nina wa Dina Dalwisi Sudika Kaktigosis Baby, Ababeki Pudabit, Inchilida Willada Debigwet, Apmigmagi. Welcome, Senator. My question is, as an Indigenous woman, when we looked at the inquiry and even Bill S3, where I lost my identity and now just since August have received my identity back as Section 6A of the Indian Act, but I also want to look in June of 2003, the 231 call to justice. How, everybody doesn't seem to be talking about that. I just want your feelings and how you feel that it should be implemented and what steps, because it's in all governments, from Indian to provincial and federal. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to acknowledge your recent reinstatement and as a member of your tribe by virtue of the change to the Indian legislation, which we brought about during the Senate. That amendment was created by senators and insisted upon by senators. The government didn't want that change, and we made it happen. So I'm glad to see that it's worked to your benefit. One of the things that unfortunately has happened is that the conversation around the importance of the calls to action, or the calls to justice by the inquiry into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls of Canada has been sidetracked by the talk around genocide. And the sidetracking, I think, was deliberate. I think it was intended to detract from the very important question about what it is that we need to do in order to bring justice and healing to the families of those victims. I think the first thing we need to think about is how can we bring justice and healing to those families. They should be properly compensated. They should be properly memorialized. I think we should acknowledge that grave injustice has been done to their memory by those officials who were responsible for ensuring that their cases were properly investigated and in fact were not properly investigated, all of which was identified in the report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. So I think we need to begin with that. And secondly, we need to look clearly at putting in place those programs and changes to policies that are necessary to prevent Indigenous women and girls from being victimized in the first place, whether it's by Indigenous men in their communities, non-Indigenous men in urban areas, or the institutions of government which are supposed to be there to protect them, such as the child welfare system. Most of the victims identified by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry were at one time children of the child welfare system. And in fact, most of the incarcerated men in this country are victims of the child welfare system who were apprehended at one point in time. And if the purpose of our child welfare system is to take children into care for the purpose of protecting them from harm in the environment in which they're located, by not providing them with a place of safety and by harming them further and by damaging them further so that when they come out of that system, they themselves are even more damaged, the system of the child welfare system is failing our children. And we need to recognize that, and we need to change that system. In addition to that, I think we also need to recognize that more resources need to be put in place to assist families to be able to come together and to stay together. When I was a little boy, my mother died. My father was a war veteran, but in addition to that had been abused in residential school, so he was living a double trauma in his life. And he was unable to take care of us, so he handed us over to his mother, my grandmother, to take care of us. My grandmother was 64. My grandfather was 69 when me and my 4 brothers and sisters went to live with them. And when we were taken into their house, my grandmother created an Indigenous child welfare system. She assigned each one of us to one of the aunties. And so I was assigned to an auntie when I was a year old, and that auntie was responsible for raising me under the supervision of my grandmother to ensure that I was properly raised. And so wherever she went as a teacher, she became a teacher, wherever she went, I went with her. To be treated like her son, to take care of her and to do her work for her as a son would. And I had that very special relationship with my aunt. And so we need to understand that Indigenous people inherently have the ability to take care of their own children, and we need to figure out a way to empower that and to make that happen, instead of assuming that professionally trained social workers are the only answer. They're not.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from up in the balcony. No? Oh, sorry. We'll go to you then, Fraser.
You just look taller than everybody else, that's why we thought.
Hello, my name is Lucy Knockwood. I'm Mi'kmaq. I go to the Montessori School of Charlottetown, and I was wondering, do you think that there were Aboriginals appointed to the Senate to raise opinions or give false hope, or do you think that this is changing the lives of people?
I want you to know, incidentally, that's a very good question, and you're quite right to ask it, because I think that to a certain extent there has been tokenism that has occurred throughout our history, and even today, in which some of our people have been appointed to positions so that people who have been doing the appointing can say, look what we've done. We have somebody here who is an Indigenous person, and therefore we've done good. I see that happening all the time in corporate Canada, for example, where Indigenous people are being co-opted now to be the voice of petroleum industry, forestry, and mining companies. And I see it also in some political circles. And we do have to recognize that there is a risk to be run by acknowledging people being appointed to positions who do not know their culture, do not know their language, do not know their history, who are simply going to be a brown face applying the white man's law. And that's a known phenomenon, and we need to guard against that. So we need to ensure that those who are appointed are in fact representative, not just of the community in terms of their color and membership, but also in terms of their knowledge about their past, their ability to live by those teachings that are part of that knowledge base, and that they can figure out how to make it work within an existing environment. When I was a young lawyer, if I can tell you a short story, I hope you don't mind. When I was a young lawyer out of law school, I decided to quit practicing law. I wanted to quit because I thought I was working in a system that was so unfair to our people that I couldn't be part of it. It wasn't a system that had been historically used to oppress Indigenous people. And I felt guilty and I felt ashamed for being part of it. And so I decided to quit. I went to speak to an elder, a man I had a great deal of respect for, about it, and he listened to me all day. And he at the end of the day, spoke to me about my decision, which I had already made, and was just wanting his reinforcement. And he said to me, if you want, you can go be that carpenter that you think you can be. He said, or you can go be a plumber or go work on cars, which are things that I had thought about I could do. He said, or you could go and do other things. He said, but remember this, that you will never stop knowing about law. And people will always come to you for advice about law because you have that knowledge. And there are very few people in our community that have that knowledge. So you will always have that responsibility to share what you know. But you make that decision for yourself. He said, but also remember this, he said, your problem is not that you can't be a good lawyer. He said, you are a good lawyer because I've seen you in court. And someday, he said, you might even be a good judge. But he said, you will never be the kind of lawyer that you can be, and you will never be the kind of judge that you can be if you do not know who you are. So you need to find out what it means to be an Anishinaabe so that you can be a better husband, you can be a better father, you can be a better brother, you can be a better son, and you can be a better grandfather to your grandchildren. He said, our challenge in life is not to be better at the white man in doing this work. Our challenge in life is to be the best human being that we can be, because that's what the Creator asks of all of us. And so that's our challenge. Those who come to these positions from whatever background, if Indigenous people are appointed to the Senate, if Indigenous people are appointed to boards or to other positions within public life, the one question that they need to answer for themselves and others have the right to ask them is, what kind of Indigenous person are you? What are your teachings? Do you know your teachings? So you feel free to continue to ask that question of them, okay? Because that's a legitimate question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back over to your side, Rosie. We have another question there.
Hello, Senator. My name's Michelle Goff, and it's an honor to hear you speak today and also be on Mi'kmaq territory. I'm from Ontario, and I'm taking a break from teaching at a Catholic elementary school to do my PhD at UPEI. And I've had the honor of listening to your son as well talk at a Catholic school board about Orange T-shirt Day. So it's great to meet the legend. I feel like you're a rock star, and I'm here today. It's pretty crazy. But my thesis and my interest is about treaty education and looking at statistics. 1% of self-identified Indigenous people are in the public school systems in PEI, and most Indigenous students are in public school systems. So with this sort of disproportionate statistic, what advice would you give to non-Indigenous teachers about shifting that attitude that because they're not Indigenous, they can't talk about Indigenous history, culture, and ideas.
I know that that's a resistance that has occurred because of the vacuum that exists because we do not have enough teachers who have that knowledge. But let me tell you, again, a variation upon the answer that I just gave to the previous young student, and that is that often our own people don't know the answers to those questions and that information. They don't know their own culture. They don't know their own history. And so to simply assume that every Indigenous person can teach that because they're an Indigenous person is sometimes a false assumption and needs to be tested. So we need to ensure that those who are put in positions of being asked to provide those teachings have in fact the ability to deliver those teachings. So whether it's an Indigenous or non-Indigenous person, I would ask every institution, every educational institution in this country to ensure that those who are placed in positions to provide that kind of education to the children of this country have a good working knowledge about what it is that they're being called upon to teach. You would not think about putting somebody in to teach mathematics who did not know mathematics. You would not think to put somebody in to teach history who did not know history. You would not think to put somebody in to teach literature who did not know literature. So why would you think to put somebody into a position to teach Indigenous history and to teach treaties who did not know what treaties were? And if they know what treaties were, and if they know what the treaty relationship is about, because they have been educated in that by people who have that knowledge and are recognized as experts in that knowledge field, then they should be entitled to teach that. But self-education sometimes can be a misleading process. And so I forewarn all teachers that simply reading books is not the answer. You actually have to go and speak to and be educated by those who have that knowledge base and are recognized as having that proper knowledge base. And they can include these days now university professors. We now have more university educators than we've ever had before, and we have more university students from the Indigenous community than we've ever had before. And they're willing to share that knowledge with those who are in search of it so that their young relatives will be provided with a proper foundation going forward in life.
Thank you very much. We have another question over on my left, up there, Fraser.
Yes, we do.
Hi, my name is Nick McIntyre. Thank you for coming, Senator Sinclair. I have a status on my mother's side, and I'd like to know how you feel about whether reconciliation is truly happening when the federal government continues to fight our people in court. When you bring up the child welfare situation and the Trudeau government would rather appeal the decision than honor and help these children get out of welfare.
No. That's the answer to the question. It does not contribute to reconciliation when the government continues to fight Indigenous people over what the courts themselves have said is their right.
Okay, thanks again. Now we do have a question from the balcony.
Hello, my traditional name is Eagle Dancer. My formal name is Richard Lush. I got the blessing to meet you a little bit in Ottawa when I was welcomed to join the chamber in an event called Indigenize the Senate. I think it was in August of this past year. So first off, I would like to welcome you to Mi'kmaq. Thank you so much for everything you do for us Indigenous people across Canada. You are a superstar, as you say, and as
no, I'm a rock star.
Rock star. for myself as a youth growing up, I have two men up on that stage where I've looked up to for a long, long time. So Walalio, thank you for you two. My question today is, with now the election in the rearview mirror, what do you feel like the movement, if any at all, on the Declaration of the Rights of the Indigenous People or UNDRIP, what do you feel with the government now is going to be, if there's going to be any change at all or any movement at all?
Well, I think the pressure will always be on the federal government to enact legislation similar to Bill C-262, which was allowed to die on the order paper in the Senate. Bill C-262 said nothing more than that the federal government should do an analysis of its legislation to ensure that, that all federal legislation complies with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Some people said that it was in fact enacting the UN Declaration as a law of Canada. It was not doing that and cannot in fact do that. It's interesting because I think one of a significant event that's occurred that I think is going to add impetus to the federal government recommitting to doing what Bill C-262 did is what occurred recently in British Columbia, where they have introduced legislation to bring the laws of British Columbia into compliance with the UN Declaration, because ultimately, as we said in the TRC report, every provincial government, every municipal government, and the federal government needs to look carefully at the way it is doing business, including its own legislation, policies, and regulations, to ask itself the question of whether those pieces of legislation, those regulations, those policies are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and whether the UN Declaration and the principles behind it can be utilized as a framework for conversations around reconciliation within their various jurisdictions. So I think the federal government will inevitably have no choice but to introduce legislation similar to Bill C-262, and if they don't do it, I suspect that we will do it through the Senate.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question,
Yep.
and it's coming from my right side.
This will be the last one.
Hi, Senator. My name is Chelsea Perry, and I'm here with the province. My question for you, let me pull it up. It's not really PEI focused, but more Canada-wide. It's regarding the construction of the Trans-Canada Pipeline. With Coastal GasLink claiming it has signed agreements with elected First Nation chiefs along the proposed route, while hereditary chiefs have not given consent, my question for you is, how do we as a province and as a country create a better relationship and consultation process with not only the elected chiefs, but the hereditary?
One of the things that has been asserted from time to time when it comes to pipelines generally, Trans-Canada Pipeline included, has been that various First Nations along the line that the pipeline is being drawn or being laid have signed what they're calling consent forms, which are really not consent forms. They're signing what are called documents which are really only impact benefit agreements, which really are agreements that if there is employment to be offered, then their community will be offered employment. If there is damage that's occurred because of the pipeline, that their community will be included in assessing the damage or will be hired in order to clean up the damage. So the impact benefits agreements are not necessarily consent documents, and in fact, most of the First Nation leaders who I've spoken to who've signed impact benefit agreements have said that they were told they had no choice because sometimes they already have impact benefit agreements in place and that these are simply renewals of those agreements. And what is occurring now is that the First Nation communities, who are not necessarily the traditional leaders of the community, these are elected officials under the Indian Act, which is, again, remember, is a federal law, that those leaders are, the First Nation elected leaders under the Indian Act are often in conflict with the traditional leaders, and those traditional leaders are usually the elders and the clan leaders of their tribe, who say that before you sign agreements like this or before you give consent, you need to get our approval because you are not authorized to do that. Traditionally, the authority comes from the traditional leaders of the community. And the government of Canada says they don't recognize that. They recognize the First Nations leaders elected under the Indian Act, and that's creating a conflict. And I think the federal government has to stay out of that business, and each community, each tribe has to sort that out for themselves. So there is a conversation that needs to go on within each tribal entity about how they're going to resolve those differences, and they need to resolve them because the future of Canada depends upon it, and sometimes their own community's future depends upon it as well. And I would say that the one thing that we need to recognize is that there are developments that are going to occur, not necessarily pipelines, but there are developments that are going to occur which will in fact be worthwhile for Indigenous communities to be partners in, because it will provide long-term benefits and income for the community. I'm thinking of the mining industry in particular, where they will be able to share ultimately in the product and in the benefit of the product. So I think that there needs to be a much further and better conversation than has been occurring in the past. Thank you.
So thank you all for those questions, and thank you, Senator Sinclair, for being such a gracious response for us all.
Before I forget, incidentally, traditionally, and my staff have always said that I should be sure to let people know, selfies are available later on, so because I know that some of you are going to rush the stage after this, so let's do it in a more organized fashion than that. And incidentally, let me say as well that, I didn't get a chance to say this during my remarks, but I'll say it now, that Prince Edward Island is the envy of Western Canada, because you're the only province in all of Canada that can separate with a snap of the finger and a cutting off of the bridge. Thank you.
Thank you again, Senator. And as we draw to a close, I would like to thank Senator Sinclair once again, Senator Francis, Premier Dennis Kin, Julie Pellissier-Lush, and the Confederation Center Youth Chorus for their participation in today's ceremony and lecture.
So the last word in French. Thank you all for coming to take part of this Symons Medal Lecture 2019. We hope to see you next year.
Presentation in 2:20. Merci beaucoup.